So to find the inverse of a graph is you switch the domain and range. So my function inverse, that's going to be, you switch the x and y, switch the x and y, switch the x and y. This one, G inverse, switch the x and y, switch the x and y, switch the x and y. It's going to be your inverse. Now to graph the inverse, so the first thing we need to do is switch the domain and range. So switching the domain and range. So now I need to graph those points. So 2, 1, 2, -4, and 8, 7. Now, just to kind of show you, if I were to graph the original, so that's going to be 1, 2, -4, 2, and 7, 8. It's actually going to be so it should be here. This one should be here. All of them are going to have this symmetry over that line y equals x. You could fold it over that line and those points are going to line up. For this graph right here, it's a good idea to find some points. So first find some points. So if I plugged in 0, you get -7. If I plugged in 1, 1 cubed is 1, 1 minus 7 is -6. If I plugged in 2, 2 cubed is 8, 8 minus 7 is 1. Plugged in -1, -1 cubed is -1, minus 7 is -8. So that means the inverse, all you have to do is switch the x and y values. So this is what you're going to graph. So graphing the -7, 0, 6, 1, 2, -8, -1. Now, thinking about the parent graph, I'm going to do that. And so that's going to get reflected over the y equals x. And so it's actually going to look like, so it's like as if it's on like sideways. So finding the inverse, switch the x and y. Now solve for y, so add 3. Divide by 4. Square root both sides. Now, because of this, we have the plus or minus, which means I can't state that this is a function. So we leave it in terms of y equals. For this one, I could write it with my inverse notation, because when you solve it, you're not going to get that plus or minus. Now for number 9, it says the hint being to factor it first. And so before you switch the x and y, this actually factors into that. A times z factors that to b. Now you can switch the x and y. And now you can solve it. Find the inverse. And again, because of that plus or minus, it's not a function, and you can't write the inverse notation. So for the parent graphs, remember this is the rational. It's going to be a little bit hard to write with this pen, but we have a horizontal shift of -2, vertical shift of 4. So we have our vertical and horizontal asymptotes there. And so we can draw in our parent graph. Domain, -infinity to -2. It can't be there because the asymptote. And the range is going to +4. And it can't be there because of the asymptote. Last, for factoring, this is the difference of squares. So that'll be 3m plus 4 and 3m minus 4. For this, factor out what's in common. A times c factors that add to b. And this one, same idea, factor out what's in common.